Good morning, and thank you so much for joining us for this latest Middle East Institute virtual event. I'm Charles Lister, the Director of MEI's Countering Terrorism and Extremism and Syria programs, and I'm really thrilled to bring you an esteemed panel who I'll introduce shortly to discuss and perhaps debate the state of US counterterrorism policy and the extent to which it has succeeded or failed in the past, and whether and in what ways it might require a rethink going forward. Just hours ago, MEI published a paper by one of our panelists, Douglas London, a non-resident scholar with MEI's Countering Terrorism and Extremism program, which argues that, quote, while terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS have innovated and adapted, US counterterrorism strategy has remained unchanged, fighting yesterday's war while neglecting present-day threats as well as those over the next horizon. The public-facing consensus amongst US government counterterrorism officials has long been that CT policy has on the whole been a success. The US has not been struck by a major mass casualty attack since 9/11. Al-Qaeda's leadership has been killed or forced into hiding, and ISIS's territorial caliphate has been destroyed. But this conceals the wider picture. That the number and size of terrorist organizations has increased markedly, as has the scale of territory and the number of countries they operate within. Worse still, some of our terrorist adversaries appear to have gotten smarter, more flexible, and they've embraced strategies designed specifically to neutralize or work around our long-standing strategy and tactics. For 20 years now, we've near perfected our ability to take out dangerous operatives, utilizing unmanned drones and precision weapons. The recent arrival onto the scene of the R9X Hellfire missile, an inert or non-explosive missile that deploys 6 razor-sharp blades shortly before impact, exemplifies our current focus on exploiting technological superiority in a game of high-stakes whack-a-mole. But while this might give us confidence in the security of the US homeland from massive attacks, is it enough? With instability likely to persist across swathes of the Middle East, Africa, and South Asia, and with the damaging economic effects of COVID yet to be seen, our terrorist adversaries will continue to be presented with opportunities for growth. The trend towards jihadist localization, whereby globalist tendencies and goals take a backseat and local dynamics become a driving factor, raises the risk even further of widening ungoverned spaces and huge displaced populations to become areas ripe for exploitation. And so, with the presidential election here just months away, there could be no better time to start addressing this issue head on. And to do that today, I really am delighted to introduce a truly fantastic panel of acclaimed experts and practitioners. First, we have Douglas London, a non-resident fellow here at MEI's Countering Terrorism and Extremism program. Doug is a retired, decorated 34-year veteran of the CIA's clandestine service, with experience in executive positions and field assignments as CIA Chief of Station and Director of Intelligence Representative, the President's Senior Intelligence Representative. Doug has served extensively across the Middle East, Africa, South and Central Asia, and was a CIA subject matter expert on counterterrorism, Iran, and weapons of mass destruction. Next, we have Chris Costa, who's currently the Executive Director of the International Spy Museum here in Washington, D.C. Recently, Chris served as Special Assistant to the President and as Senior Director for Counterterrorism at the National Security Council. Chris was also Program Director at the US Special Operations Command's Operations Directorate and a Navy civilian at the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, otherwise known as the Navy SEALs Team 6. In 2013, Chris was inducted into SOCOM's Commando Hall of Honor for his extraordinary service to Special Operations Forces. And finally, we have Karen Greenberg, who is the Director of the Center on National Security at Fordham University School of Law. An acclaimed expert on national security, terrorism, and civil liberties, Karen is the author of multiple books, including The Least Worst Place, Guantanamo's First 100 Days, which was selected by the Washington Post as one of its best books. Karen is also a permanent member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Doug, Chris, and Karen, welcome on board to this event. A few final notes in terms of format. In terms of the format, each panelist today will begin with roughly 5 minutes of opening remarks, followed by a moderated discussion by myself. This event is live on Zoom and on MEI's live stream. To the many people worldwide currently dialed into this event on Zoom, I encourage you all to submit questions on the Q&A feature, which you should see on your screens. For those calling into Zoom by phone or watching on our live stream, you can submit questions to us by emailing events@mei.edu. Feel free to submit questions at any point during the event. I will do my very best to work them into the discussion. And so without further ado, let me turn things over to Doug. Let's hear from you.
Good morning, Charles, and thank you for that kind introduction. And thank you as well to MEI for publishing my paper and including me on such a distinguished panel. I think you captured the salient points well from points I was trying to highlight, that I believe the United States counterterrorism strategy has suffered from being stagnant, a bit too tunnel vision, and relying on metrics that don't best inform what our approach and policy should be. Its kinetic, preemptive approach neglects, for one thing, the very conditions that give rise to extremism, which I believe would be better served through a more holistic, whole of government approach. Using the term soft power is kind of loaded these days and has all sorts of negative connotations, but I believe it's beyond how people sometimes think of it. It speaks more to a buffet of options that vary from diplomacy to economic investment in human rights, influence, and the like. I think another one of the problems that it has suffered from has been the way we approach it as an intelligence community. Because the strategy itself is reliant on a kinetic tool as its first and often, perhaps unfortunately, default option, though by law and statute, that is not how it's intended to be. The intelligence prioritization tends itself to be geolocational. Rather than invest in the type of intelligence, be it UMINT or SIGINT, that provides a greater insight into groups, their organization, their strategy dynamics that might inform the more holistic options that are available beyond kinetic. It's more about putting people on the X and removing them. The sense that, which has become more like whack-a-mole, if you take away the terrorist operatives, you take away their plans and their actions. But what we've seen is it gives rise to yet a whole new series of terrorists, and it gives rise to a now decentralized terrorist landscape that has all manner of Al-Qaeda affiliates, ISIS, various branches that can operate independently. And as you also noted, my paper speaks to our inflexibility to adapting to the threat and landscape itself. We've seen over the years since 9/11, as I suggested, that it's no longer a centrally located leadership, which is funding, planning, directing operations, and in a rather remote part of the world. It's spread. We have quite a significant domestic threat. And a lot of this now, based on the inspiration of folks like Anwar al-Awlaki, who is an AQAP scholar, has focused on do-it-yourself-at-home terrorist operations. If you have folks who we can't really identify or preempt abroad, it makes it harder to neutralize their efforts. So I believe all in all, we just need to rethink what the threat landscape looks like, what our problems are, and how best to address them with an eye towards the future instead of one towards the past.
Doug, thank you so much for very concise opening remarks. We'll pass now on to Chris.
Hey, thank you very much for having me, Charles. Thank you very much for Middle East Institute hosting this. Doug, great paper. It's thought-provoking. Great to see you again, Karen. So I'd like to start off with four questions. First, what did the threat picture look like in 2017 when our team stood up, the Trump team? What were some of the basic assumptions that were the underpinning for the counterterrorism strategy that was published in 2018? What were some of the crucial capabilities to maintain? And what does this mean in terms of the question that Doug addressed? I'd like to provide context to some of what Doug laid out, which I don't dispute broadly. So first of all, what was the threat picture? Let's take a look at 2016 turning into 2017. There were a dizzying amount of attacks that were ISIS inspired throughout Europe, across the Middle East. ISIS inspired or ISIS directed, either one. They were breaking out, it was significant. And we suffered on day one, really 4 key decisions that we had to deal with almost immediately. knowing that we were going to have to frame a counterterrorism framework, understanding that we wanted to get to some of the issues that you talk about, Doug. We had a disrupted landscape from really the Maghreb, Sahel, to the Horn of Africa, to the Middle East, through Afghanistan, Pakistan, and even the Philippines, which was completely unexpected. But on day one, the problems that we dealt with were the need to accelerate the ISIS campaign, the Defeat ISIS campaign. Clearly, we're going to continue the work done by the previous administration. Secondly, we had to make a decision that first week on whether we were going to go after Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula or not. We did go after AQAP. There was an intelligence raid. And thirdly, we had a pervasive and a significant threat to commercial aviation. And fourth, we had hostages in Africa, in the Middle East, held by Iran, held by Syria, held by the Haqqani network and the Afghan Pakistani border. So that said, I would like to tell you that I came in with the idea that we would focus on some root cause issues, that we would focus on countering violent extremism or counter-radicalization. But first and foremost, while we were framing the 2018 strategy, what we really had to focus on was defeating ISIS. But those were the day one problems. So let me talk about the assumptions that were underpinning the counterterrorism network. Very briefly, in short, to Doug's point, we recognized we couldn't focus only on kinetic activities. We would have to focus more broadly on diplomatic initiatives, strategic communications, as well as economic sanctions. And I'll make the point, if we have time, if not now during questions, on how we applied those. Thirdly, and this is really, or secondly, a crucial point, counterterrorism from pre-9/11 through preemptive policy under George W. Bush through the present day was evolutionary. It was not revolutionary. I challenge my bosses to tell me, not the president, but Homeland Security Advisor and the National Security Advisor, what's the big idea they were looking for? Because I searched for big ideas, our team did, and we didn't find any big ideas. So in essence, what it had to be, the strategy going forward, was a series of actions that were going to take advantage of all of our instruments of power. And finally, just to wrap up, the threat landscape had changed. So what were those important changes? Just to finish up on my opening remarks, first and foremost, taking a professional team of interagency professionals from the intelligence community, non-politicized individuals that were there to represent really the president as his staff, but also to be unbiased in their approach to our instruments for really getting at the CT strategy. Not only did we recognize that we, as I alluded to, needed to operationalize getting hostages home, but we needed to pivot on some new ideas. In those three important changes, I will summarize now, then I'll close my opening remarks. First and foremost, imagine that we focused on racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism for the first time in the history of our counterterrorism approaches, pre-9/11 through post-9/11 through the present day. It's the first time a strategy focused on white supremacists, neo-Nazis, and if that framing was not done, we wouldn't have designated the Russian imperial movement, for example, as a terrorist organization. So I think that's an important change that I want to highlight based on the framing. Secondly, Hezbollah, another example, we certainly didn't focus on them kinetically. So we focused on sanctions, we focused on really starving them of their cash. That's another quick example. And thirdly, we at least provided a prevention overarching architecture for counter-radicalization. And we're just now enjoying the fruits of that labor, meaning the Homeland Security, for example, Department of Homeland Security is going after targeting, killings, and really studying the idea of mass shootings and looking at gun control. These kinds of things have been mostly ignored, but the framing in the 2018 strategy allows us to focus more broadly on issues that we didn't focus on the past strategy in 2011 that almost only focused on Al-Qaeda. So the threat landscape has changed. I'm proud to say that there's some framing that allows us to more broadly focus these tools on a whole different threat landscape. Thank you.
Chris, thank you so much. I think that was a really important sort of complementary perspective, laying out really the challenge, the sheer scale and scope of threats and challenges, and the difficulty of tackling all of them all at once from day one. But I think that was really important. So thank you, Karen. After you.
Sure. So first, I want to join everybody in thanking Douglas for writing this report. And its time has come to reflect on where we're coming from and where we're going. And sort of some of us on the outside have been waiting for not just lessons learned, but a deep dive into the mindset that brought us counterterrorism policy for the past almost 20 years. And so there's a lot of reflection in here about whether it went wrong or not, what needs to change. And I was gratified by seeing that and interested in it. My comments come in a series of questions to sort of how you went about this and how you framed it, Doug. And so I think I'll just start in. One of the things is that you, and it's again gratifying to see, want to downplay the kinetic response, the military response, the militarized responses of other agencies outside the military. And you talk about a holistic approach, as you've said, but that conversation has been going on for a long time. There has been a push, whether it's State Department, whether it's on the ground, civil society efforts. The idea for a holistic approach that addresses grassroots issues has been part of the counterterrorism conversation, maybe not centrally, but it's been there for a long time. My question to you is, has the conversation changed enough that this could now become broader than just some sort of effort that doesn't seem to be able to get realized because of opponents, because of logistics, because of funding, because of organizational things? What is it? Why do you think now that there's a more receptive audience at the government level for this? So that's my first question. My second question is that you talk a lot about the dangers of thinking we could do too much abroad, right? And taking full responsibility for it. And on the other hand, you don't really say, in the scenario you've laid out, how would we not be doing too much? And I'm assuming that what you're talking about is about international cooperation and where the United States is going to fit into this larger international conversation. But I'd like you to sort of weigh in on the distinction between wanting to build a civil society abroad and wanting to do what you're presenting here. One of the strongest parts of this report is its sense of time. The idea that we're not going to get there quickly. We know that after 2 decades. But your acceptance of that fact, and that there is a transformational effort that needs to go on. And in part of that conversation, you talk about metrics and flash, and how the idea of how we account for the resources we give to counterterrorism is too much diminished by the need to produce metrics and, this many schools, this many non-terrorist, this many disrupted attacks, this many. And I think you're making a really good point. And so my further idea of that is, and this kind of goes with my first question, is how much education do we have to do here to restructure our approach and understand what the transformative means and what time means? And I think that's very important. Another thing, building off what you and Chris both said, has to do with our threat assessments. And I'm thinking more broadly than our terrorist threat assessments, but more generally, in terms of our global threat assessments, because you'll notice that terrorism has not been on the top of our global threat assessment of late. What does that mean for the terrorist effort? And one of the things that Doug's paper points out is that all of these other things, poverty, climate change, education, I would add displaced populations, that these things are among the factors that you want to address, but they are also among the threats themselves in terms of what threatens the globe and the stability of the globe. And so do we need to think about a different way, getting back to your metrics and flash, of how we prioritize and how we even name what the global threat is? Do we need to really rethink that? I feel like we're still in the same old categories. And what you're really saying here in some part is, how do we get outside of those categories? And I think it's valuable in raising that question. One other thing I just want to mention, because just in case, is about domestic terrorism, which you both brought up, okay? So I have to say this, all right. Doug, in your paper, and it's kind of an aside to what else you're saying, you talk about the white extremist terrorism in the United States and elsewhere and how it's on the rise. And you talk about the fact that there is not enough broad police powers to be able to surveil and determine who's going to be a potential terrorist. And I would say it sort of stands in contradiction to your argument in the paper, which is that hard power needs to give way more space to soft power, equities, interest, and strategies. And so I would suggest that maybe when we get to the domestic terrorism statute issue, but we have a lot of statutes, a lot of comprehensive and important statutes for prosecuting these crimes, and why you think that broader police powers, rather than some on the ground, softer power efforts, isn't really, maybe you should apply that domestically as well. So that's the sum total of my comments for now.
Karen, thank you so much for those really pointed questions. I think at least at this early stage, you've taken my role. So I will let Doug answer your questions first, rather than me throw more in at your way.
Well, thanks, Charles. You're welcome to answer all those questions, which, thoughtful as they are, test my ability to remember and address them all. So I'll do my best. But they're all really good and they're all on point. Maybe one way to address it is to give a sense of what it's like being on the inside, dealing with this from the CIA point of view. Chris made some really good points, and I know that most every administration comes in with, good ideas. They're well-intentioned. They want to deal with things transformationally if they can, and then they're very quickly overwhelmed by pressures. No day passes where there aren't any number of threats, each and every day. And we try to measure them in terms of imminence and credibility when we try to prioritize how best to address them. But we're also subject to the same political pressures that everyone else is, and political in the sense that people want an answer. Our intelligence is going across the community saying, well, there's a threat here, there's a threat there, and the administration is make it go away. So it's a lot easier to sort of address pressures like that with metrics that speak to tangible, often kinetic results. There's a threat, here are some people involved in the threat, and they're removed from the battlefield, whether they're killed in a counter-terrorist operation, whether they're detained by most likely a foreign partner. And that at least gives you a little breathing space. But the more that cycle continues, the less indulgence there is to assign and align resources and people to all the other aspects to which Chris spoke and to which you're speaking. There certainly are offices that address covert influence inside the agency. State Department has its public diplomacy. There's economic programs. But yet we keep going back to very much a scorched earth policy in dealing with threats, and we don't slow down to kind of look at what's going to grow out of that scorched earth if we don't leave something else behind. I spoke in my paper about a sort of a variant on the Marshall Plan, and of course that will scare people because people will imagine the amazing cost the US bore pretty much on its shoulder to rebuild Europe and likewise as it did in Japan. But something more thoughtful that speaks to what you mentioned, Karen, in terms of relying on partners, having more achievable waypoints and results. I just want to touch on the domestic, probably because it's the last thing you said, and I'm too old to remember everything in the middle. But what I'm speaking to on that is more a case of intelligence and less about brute force. There's great debate, and you're a legal scholar, about do we already have the legal authorities and the statutes to deal with domestic terrorism, whether it's white supremacists or ultranationalist militias. But what I have seen firsthand in the Counterterrorist Center is our law enforcement partners focused on what they could bring to court. So the FBI, which is a fabulous organization, which works terribly hard, well-intentioned, has only so much bandwidth, and they're measured by cases prosecuted. They go to the United States attorneys with possible leads, people that they might have seen come up on their scope because there's some tie to, speaking to things that might suggest domestic terrorism, but they're very limited in what they could do unless they have a case, unless they have evidence. So the Bureau has a very prosecutorial approach, which is based on evidence, which isn't as based on preemption, insight, and understanding. But that doesn't address your point about, well, what are the complementary soft powers that we could use to actually deal with the problems of domestic terrorism, as I'm likewise suggesting we do abroad. It's obviously, again, a holistic approach that involves all facets of the US voice, inside and outside government. But I think it aligns with my thinking that you need to look at conditions, because if even you take a transactional approach based on just arrest, you're not really addressing the problem, and the problem will expand. I hope that at least touches on most of what you asked.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Doug. Chris, I'll come to you with a sort of 40,000-foot question, which brings in the domestic situation in the US. I mentioned in my opening comments, part of the reason for looking at this is the fact that the presidential election is coming up and people are looking at foreign policy in general. I mean, occasionally looking at foreign policy within the context of the elections. So the big question is, so from Doug's paper, I think one of the main lessons I took from it is something that has driven a lot of my work recently, which is that our terrorist adversaries are adapting, they are evolving. We have a wider margin of challenges and threats, and both challenges and threats pose different policy conundrums. But the implication, I think, from Doug's paper is that, in a sense, the US needs to do more. And Doug just mentioned the Marshall Plan. That obviously contradicts or rubs up against the popular opinion, or at least perceptions of popular opinion in this country, which is wholly against the idea of doing anything more than what we're already doing, and ideally limiting what we're doing today. So I don't know if this is kind of an impossible square to circle, but how does a government that recognizes the scope of threats and challenges deal with that political reality without either threatening one's re-election chances or simply by pursuing a policy which is deeply politically unpopular? I mean, how does one square that circle?
So, Charles, that's an excellent question. In short, I believe the strategy provided, the 2018 strategy, provided a very reasonable framework to do the work that's required that meets the objectives of this administration. And candidly, if you agree with my argument that each administration has taken what previous administrations have done and really expanded on it and been very adaptable. Much like our adversaries, we've had a tool that hasn't been politicized. Although there might be political rhetoric, the counterterrorism process with the professionals like Doug and others represented in the community, and the academics that we went to, people like you, Charles. So if you have any problems with the strategy, we can blame Charles as well, because he advised us on aspects of it. But that said, it was as holistic as we could get with the situation we were dealing with. So let me just go back to where we are right now. Just a quick summary. So ISIS has no physical caliphate. To your point, that means the ISIS jihadi problem is going to be more localized. That doesn't mean branches and affiliates aren't going to collaborate, which we are starting to see in Africa, for example. But all that said, AQAP, one example, significantly under stress in the Arabian Peninsula. Peace and reconciliation, notwithstanding current the situation and reporting in Afghanistan, there is a potential for that to even out over time. It'll get worse before it gets better, but there are some opportunities to end, and I think Doug talks about this, the idea of forever US wars with large-scale troop deployments. And that was a result, I think, of some of the framing. And CT is not first and foremost. It wasn't on day one of the administration. That I can tell you. There were other issues that took center stage. So we quietly did our work. That said, terrorism is more localized. But there are significant problems in the future that we have to square. And that is this idea of future radicalization of people in camps like Al-Hol. Significant problems, future problems that aren't going to go away. But it's not exclusively a United States problem. It is an international problem. But that said, now we have other concerns. And just to finish up on the idea of racially and ethnically motivated extremists, violent extremists, that's a mouthful, that's the term of art. But the fact of the matter is that will be a significant concern, whether it's a Biden administration or a Trump administration. And this is the evolving threat. But I think also, I am very confident that federal FBI in particular and DHS are very much focused on priorities for focusing on that threat stream, which means Boogaloo movement as well as Antifa, as well as other militia movements. These are the concerns that we're going to have, but I think the framing is there. But it's not going to be war winning. A strategy is just a framing for doing detailed work at the interagency. But I think it's appropriately set to do that.
Chris, thank you. Thanks for your answer. Karen, I'll turn to you with another similarly sort of 40,000 foot level question to start off with before we go perhaps more into the weeds. Another point Doug references in his paper is, and specifically in relation to his experience in and the intelligence community's experience in recruiting terrorists to spy on behalf of the US government, is that ideology doesn't necessarily always prove to be the #1 sort of insertion factor in terms of turning people. It's not necessarily the #1 driver of many terrorists' actions and behaviors and motivations. So if that's true, and I certainly have some sympathy with that argument in my work. If that's true, what kind of implications does that have for policy? I mean, beyond the idea that, so there is more need for development and soft power, but in terms of the real world policy implications, that would, I assume, completely overhaul the perspective that most people embrace when it comes to counterterrorism. It's still a fairly controversial thing to raise in some CT circles. I've certainly had a lot of raised eyebrows when I tried to make the argument that ideology isn't the #1 challenge that we face here. So first of all, I guess is, do you agree? And second of all, what kind of real world implications does that have in terms of developing a rethought policy?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up because it caught my attention too, and I just didn't have a question to address to it. So I think it's a major takeaway from this report. I think we've seen this both in this country and elsewhere, that we've seen a change in the role of ideology from the early 9/11 days, before and after 9/11, to now with ISIS, the change from Al-Qaeda to ISIS. It's tied to something else Doug mentions in his report, which is the hierarchical, the decentralization rather than the hierarchical, to bin Laden, to Zawahiri. So I think it all is a pace, and we've been watching this time after time after time. And it also has a lot to do with the lone wolf phenomenon, because if there's a sense of ideology and the structure that goes with it, then the lone wolf becomes this kind of category of self-radicalized online, etc., which is very different than swearing bayat to bin Laden. Right? So I think it's been happening for a long time. We've seen it happening. They're not mutually exclusive, as you kind of suggested in your remarks, that ideology and other factors, interpersonal factors, are not mutually exclusive. But I think the consequences of this, the implications of this, are vast and important. because, and it does underscore the soft power part of it, but governance wise and policy wise, this is a very big challenge, because if it's less about ideology, then our structures, and this is partly Doug's point, we haven't figured out how to, and one of the things he says is he uses a personal experience, right? Of interacting personally with one person after another person after another person. That is not going to be the strategy most likely. On the other hand, he does mention family and community. And I think the idea of dealing with individuals and communities who want food and resources and education and peace and stability, that this is, again, a conversation we've been trying to have for a very long time. And that in and of itself, we could call it an ideology. It's not an ideology, but it is. It's a framework. We choose, what he's really saying is we choose stability over anything else that's being offered us right now. And so I think the policy implications are to run with that and to accept the fact that ideology, it still exists. You can't say ideology doesn't exist, it does, but that the vast, when you talk about the camps that these, okay, then that's there. It is a breeding ground for a kind of ideology for sure. And one of the points Doug says is basically we need to get to these people sooner than the terrorists get to them. I think the lessening of the ideological hold, the fragmentation of what the ideological message is exactly the place for policy that can come in and saying, yeah, that's okay. You have your ideology, but how about some help? How can we help? And I think I don't think this is new. I think it's new now. And I think the demise of the ideological grasp is making some room for this. And also the heightening of the problems that people are facing everywhere that can contribute to terrorism.
Karen, thank you so much for that. I think that was very, very on point. Chris, I think just to raise a couple of things that have come up in the last few answers. Al-Hol has been mentioned. The FTF issue, I think, has been implied. Ungoverned spaces has been mentioned a few times. I just wonder if I can throw all of those things together. So we've got, obviously, issues like Al-Hol are a huge issue. We have 10,000 ISIS foreign fighters and family members in detention, a huge number of other civilian members previously associated with ISIS in similar camps. There seems to be no movement in terms of returning most of those foreigners back to their own countries for prosecution, and they really are just sat there in that kind of sort of stagnant state. Beyond that, ungoverned spaces seem to be widening. I think in the Middle East, as being the Middle East Institute, we're primarily focused on the MENA region here. Ungoverned spaces seem to be widening. We've seen a return to dictatorial governance in many corners of the region, which doesn't necessarily spell great developments in terms of the rural communities in many of those countries. And in Africa, across Africa, I think we've seen a very worrying trend. Right. ISIS proliferating across into areas which have previously never really seen jihadist insurgencies. I think in Mozambique, I think there are some of the most worrying trends. I think, throwing all of those things together, and a kind of an impossible question, do we see any serious, meaningful policy response to these challenges, or is this just a sort of terrifying prospect for those of us who watch these developments? It seems to only be worsening. And obviously with COVID and domestic issues, we're prioritizing those in terms of the news agenda and the policy agenda. Is this just going to worsen? Or having, relatively recently exited from government service, is that still something that you think will be responded to in a meaningful way?
So I think it gets to it's almost a tired cliche or metaphor, the idea of a disease that can be controlled, but it's going to continue. It can be arrested in some cases, but it's not going to go away. So I said there were not going to be, in my humble opinion, there aren't going to be forever US wars with large scale footprints of US servicemen deployed. I think in the foreseeable future, that's the case. That said, this is a multi-generational fight. It's not going to go away. I use the word that the networks were growing exponentially, and I have to be careful because while I was in the White House, the footprints were growing exponentially. The blobology, if you will, the blobs of where these networks are co-joining were seeming to grow, but that didn't mean aggregate numbers, and it almost didn't matter. The problem is places that we weren't looking at because there were ungoverned spaces, we all of a sudden saw jihadi movements growing. The bottom line is people that were critical of the US government or are critical of the US government would say, people like you always offer, Chris Costa, it's a terrorism trap. If we don't give you the resources, if we don't allow you to apply those resources in sanctuaries, then it's an endless fight. And then you're going to say, when we're attacked, see, you didn't give me the resources that we needed. So this is a long-term economy of force fight. It can't be first and foremost of our policy objectives, but it's going to require strategic partnerships, which the strategy gets to, not just with intelligence actors overseas, but it's also going to mean NGOs and other actors that can help. Also service providers in that in the internet industry, for lack of a better term. And we're going to continue using small footprints of special operators with our foreign partners. And of course, the work that Doug did across the world is going to have to continue. It's not going to go away. We can't wish it to go away. And there's one other dynamic that we didn't have to contend with. It never came into our vernacular while I was in the White House, but I'm very concerned about, and that is this amalgamation of state actors conducting disinformation in a polarized United States environment, global environment, arguably, but that will also contribute to problems in the counterterrorism fight. So I'll pause there in case there's some follow-up or somebody wants to add something.
Yeah, if by the way, I should say, Doug, Karen, if you do ever, or any of you want to interject, do let me know one way or the other. But if not, I'll follow up with another follow-on question for you, Doug. I think one of the sort of underlying assumptions I mentioned in my opening comments, and I think very understandably, is that from a CT perspective, the US will always prioritize threats to the homeland in terms of sort of actionable actions. And I think, that's very understandable, but in some ways, failing to deal with those longer term, more underlying issues, or the localization of extremism. When you look at Syria, we have an Al-Qaeda affiliate that for a long time localized and I think was deemed for periods of time to be less of a threat. Now, as I understand it, the affiliate Haras al-Din was, at least until recently, deemed the most significant threat of external attacks anywhere in the world, coming from northwestern Syria. So I guess my general question is, in balancing up the threat posed to the homeland and threats to regional instability, threats to the security of our allies, should that latter component be more of a priority for us, or should we only ever be looking at the sort of utilization of a safe haven, an active utilization of a safe haven, as a means for US priority? I think so it's a kind of a leading question, because the implication of it is, if we agree on the latter, we have to do an awful lot more. We really have to spread our horizons, which poses all kinds of problems. But I'm looking at the trends we're seeing now, and some of the things I mentioned to Chris's question, especially looking at Africa. I mean, if we leave these things completely untouched, then in all likelihood, we'll be dealing with multiple active safe havens, looking at a globalist agenda as well as a local one. And by that time, we'll have simply too many threats and challenges to deal with alone. So how do we square that challenging kind of strategic conundrum?
Charles, thanks for that. It's going to help me sort of try to tie together some of the comments and questions Karen made and some of the points Chris made in terms of speaking about our policymakers right now ready to have a conversation about transformational strategies. Are they ready to discuss alternative approaches and points of view? This is going to put me at the risk of sounding more partisan, but just my practical experience was for the Trump administration, despite very thoughtful voices like Chris offered from the White House, the direction and reaction we would get from the president on counterterrorist issues tended to be very short-term, very reactionary, and very transactional. To your point about trying to highlight over the horizon issues, long-term issues, how best to approach things in a more transformational way, be it addressing underlying conditions which will allow terrorism not only to resurge in areas where we had hoped to set it back, but in new areas. That was not a conversation that was very much welcome by the president, despite our efforts to do so. And that translates into our executing the president's will. So among these considerations would very often be equities. You spoke to working with foreign partners, be they state or academic or whatever institutions they might be, which are integral to our ability, particularly to project power and capability overseas. We rely very much on foreign partners. We rely on agents to collect intelligence. And we would unfortunately, as I think we saw from our withdrawal in Northwest Syria, be too quick to compromise equities that we'd worked hard to develop with foreign governments, with people on the ground, and even with agents that were providing intelligence. I think that's part of the phenomenon that we deal with, where we get into these cycles of dealing with the same issue again and again, or sort of mortgaging our future by looking at things very transactionally. And that's been the default position of the president. I think I'll touch on another comment that Chris made and Karen made as well. And I'll be stealing from Chris here, so I hope he doesn't mind it. If people like it, I'll take credit, but otherwise I'll deflect on Chris. That the world is not a single issue. You can't have one issue without being bled over by others. The whole great power competition, geopolitical rivalries and interests absolutely influence how we address counter-terrorist issues. That likewise has been an area of complexity that has not resonated with the president. And I think we've seen that very clearly in Syria, recently in Afghanistan with reports about Russian bounties, and certainly in Libya as the Russians have expanded their influence and their presence there. You can't address counterterrorism in a vacuum. You have to deal with it in the prism of all these other issues, be it great power competition or the other considerations that Karen made and that I hope to make about all politics being local. So climate change, stability, income, health, education are key to these folks. I touched on the roles of the provincial reconstruction teams in Afghanistan and somewhat in Iraq. And I think from my personal experience, they were very well intentioned, but that's where they often fell short by not really appealing to what's going to address the mentality of the community. We saw folks in Yemen and Afghanistan and Syria welcome extremist groups, not because they believed in their ideology, but very much for the reason they brought some semblance of stability. They took away the garbage. They allowed the schools to be open. They ran a hospital. So the folks that we need to convert, we don't need to convert, if you would, to an ideology. We just need them to allow for the opportunity to work with us as a dependable partner that will address their local needs. I put it in terms of dealing with agents. I had an agent who was a member of Al-Qaeda who was thrilled at 9/11, but did a great deal to help not destroy, but certainly undermine Al-Qaeda operations because he cared about local things important to himself. So I think we need to sort of have a conversation that understands we can't do everything. We don't have infinite resources, but at least have to attempt to try to follow a more transformational approach that brings in a very multipolar, multifaceted, nuanced strategy.
Doug, thank you. Karen, next to you, a question about FTFs and particularly from a sort of legal perspective. I think, I asked Chris earlier about, or I mentioned to Chris earlier that there's minimal signs of hope in terms of a large-scale repatriation policy. These individuals are largely stuck where they are. Are you personally, if I can ask, for or against the suggested repatriation of foreign terrorist fighters? I mean, does the principle of citizenship mean that one's government is responsible for your citizens no matter what they do, no matter where in the world? And if you are or if you're not, on what basis, and how does one move forward on this issue?
Okay, well, first of all, yes. Let me start with the importance of citizenship in all of this. Understand that, and I'd be happy to hear Doug or Chris talk about that, that one of the tools of recruitment for jihadist ideology has been belonging. And the idea that you belong, we'll take you in, you can belong here. Whatever, the ideological component, that's part of the conversation. Citizenship is crucial to how a human being in the world thinks about themselves. That's what we've learned, that it matters. We've noticed in our terrorism prosecution database how many individuals had successive citizenships and didn't really feel like they belonged to one country or another. It's an important aspect of being alive on this globe, at least in current times. So I think citizenship is incredibly important in terms of how we stabilize individuals, maybe not communities, but individuals. So I do think that citizenship should be honored for those individuals, that for the foreign fighters, that they should be returned. Some of them will be prosecuted in the courts, and there have been a number of countries across the globe who have taken back their citizens. I think it is incredibly important that the children have a place to grow up that is not inside a Hull or any of these other camps, I think, and to be brought up as citizens with the rights of citizens and not to be assumed to be enemies from the age of 5 on, because if you assume them to be enemies and outsiders, there will be. So yes, I think citizenship should be honored. I think they should be returned. I think if the UK can take in all these people from Hong Kong, why can't they, right? I mean, I think there has to be an openness to this, and we can't get around it. If there's a fear associated with it, then we have to deal with what that fear means, and we have to work it through. But I think, yes, they should be taken back, and if the law feels that they should prosecute them, then they'll go to trial. But yes is the answer.
Good. Thank you. Thank you, Karen. Chris, question on countering terrorist financing. I think one big trend we've seen over the last several years, at least, is a move away from the traditional sort of finance networks from the Gulf in particular, and a move towards raising finances on a local level. I think that provides, or I assume that provides, terrorist organizations with a more sort of durable base for existence. How do we respond to that challenge? I mean, the traditional CTF mechanisms of sanctions and pressure on allies to restrict those networks or remove those networks altogether, was met with some level of success. But when we now have organizations who run legitimate and illegitimate businesses, when they rely deeply on localized hawala systems, is there anything the US government and allies can do to respond to that beyond military action or being militarily involved on the ground? Is this an example of where terrorist groups have sort of double-crossed us in that sense?
Well, I think, so that's a terrific question, and I can only offer really a strategic view of that problem. First, sanctions, as you alluded to, have worked. We have done a good job of, like I said, slowing Hezbollah's ability to pay. We have had a maximum pressure campaign placed on Iran for some time. That's caused them a great deal of strain. So we've affected proxies, but to your point specifically, our enemies have adapted in their tactical systems, hawala, as you mentioned, that are used that can certainly circumscribe our ability disrupt those mechanisms. That said, though, I did see examples over time of very, very, although I said I wanted to talk at the strategic level, tactical disruptions of seizures of money on the battlefield, in warehouses. So based on intelligence, activities followed with foreign partners to really seize money and to disrupt smuggling when it was thought to also be used illicitly to support terrorists. So I think we've done a fair job at those kinds of disruptions. It's just another adaptation on the battlefield. Our adversaries are a learning adversary.
Chris, thank you. A question for Doug, to something you mentioned in your report. Very, very sort of loosely paraphrase, but you mentioned Zawahiri's limited ability, in your opinion, to coordinate the actions of his affiliates worldwide. But you made a suggestion that two of his primary deputies based in Iran, Saif al-Adil and Abu Muhammad al-Masri, in your opinion, were more likely to be mentoring and facilitating affiliates beyond their immediate region. Just wondered if you could comment on that, what the implications are for that. Obviously, the presence of senior AQ figures in Iran has been a problem for the US for a long time. But you know, sort of, if I can ask, sort of, on what basis is that opinion formed, and what are the implications for it?
So I have to tread a little bit carefully based on what I know. So I'll start sort of with a framework that I think by and large, as I try to suggest in my paper, that Zawahiri has given up a fair bit of tactical decision-making, tactical oversight that I believe bin Laden tried to retain until his death. Zawahiri seems more content with directing vision, overall strategy, a communications approach, speaking for what the group aspires to do, sort of big picture things and not so much in the trees. Saif al-Adil, and who is quite an interesting personality from what we understand. He doesn't work and play well with others. So Abu Muhammad al-Masri is probably more well received for his guidance and such, but they're certainly more free to try to be more involved in management. I think by their nature, Saif al-Adil particularly, and Abu Muhammad al-Masri would try, but they're living under the protection of the Iranian government, and they're able to take advantage of the internet and whatever communications like anyone else. I think they balance their interest in maintaining some effort at direct oversight or mentoring to a degree, but I think they're largely following the need to delegate authorities and responsibility. Also, if I have just 30 seconds, touch on the finance issue, if I may, because I was deeply involved with that. I think folks need to understand a couple of things about finance. Terrorism is not very expensive for the terrorists. It doesn't really cost very much. The big ticket items really for terrorist groups are salaries and payments to the families of those who have been lost. So it's a tricky issue that needs attention, but we've done a better job of trying to address the big ticket kidnap for ransoming items, where they'll make $2-3 million at a shot, and some of the larger financiers that were often located in the Arabian Gulf. But I think you capture well that for their day-to-day and to fund a lot of their operations, what they collect locally is sufficient. Where they hurt is being able to pay families, the martyrs, the shaheed, as they call them. So I hope that sort of rounds out both your question and the finance one.
Absolutely, Doug. Thank you so much. To bring in a couple of questions that have come in from the audience, as well as something that I had on my list, is Karen. Obviously, you've written about, as I mentioned in the very original introductions, Guantanamo before. I just wondered, as an aside, if there's something, so any kind of sort of status update you can provide on where the issue of Guantanamo is going, whether there are continuing implications CT-wise, threat-wise, to the fact that Guantanamo continues to exist, and what kind of conundrums does this continue to pose for the US government?
How many hours do you have for me to? So, I mean, you know, Guantanamo is isolated on its island. going forward to nowhere, almost going in reverse. We still haven't tried the alleged perpetrators mastermind of 9/11. So it's sort of a place on hold. It has 40 detainees. A couple dozen of them are probably going to be there forever and not going to be returned. The rest will be tried. Do I think it has an influence on conversations? Not like other things do. I think it used to have more of an impact. I don't get that sense. But you're asking the wrong person, because I think it should be closed and the people should be tried. And if they aren't tried, then they should be released. And so not sure what you wanted to ask me, but I did want to just bring up one thing about counterterrorism strategy going forward, not about Guantanamo, which is that, as I'm listening to the conversation play out, there are two things that are kind of on my mind. One is we keep referring to proxy actors, disinformation, a lot at the nation state level. And I'm kind of curious, and the complexity of the relations, which we've how many books have been written on this, and I'm sure it's even more complex when you're inside of it. But how much is focusing on the terrorism aspect of this dependent on nation states? And I think we really, that's one piece of it we have to grapple with it. And the other thing is, listening to this conversation play out, how much of what we need to do to address it in terms of soft power doesn't need to be framed, and maybe isn't best framed as a counterterrorism measure, but as a United States and others' role in the world measure. And I know that I know the reports about counterterrorism, but just saying, a lot of these things will come in another bag, whether it's preparing against a health pandemic, whether it's preparing against the consequences of refugees. And it can't all be that the only reason we adapt all of these measures that you've talked about are to stop terrorism. I think as the conversation changed, we ought to consider that, changing the vocabulary somewhat, and that may help some of the issues. Anyway, that's it.
Karen, thank you so much. To continue the discussion and the increasing breadth of all of the issues we're looking at, Chris, I wanted to ask you about white extremism or far-right extremism. That obviously it was an issue that I know you made sure was involved or included in the 2018 strategy. Just wondered if, we've talked about root causes a fair bit so far in the last hour, but root causes of Al-Qaeda or ISIS or jihadist extremism. There's a couple questions I've seen coming in from the audience that are more or less similar. They both looked at whether or not root causes of far-right extremism pose any resemblance to the similar kind of root causes that we've seen drive the likes of AQ or ISIS, or are they markedly different? And then if so, depending on your answer, what are the implications there in terms of domestic CT policy as well as the international aspects of it?
Thanks for the question. I really appreciate the opportunity to answer this. So the bottom line is, it's the same radicalization problem, right? It's just, in fact, let me answer it this way. An advantage that I had, I would argue, at the White House, and I say this with humility, was the fact that I started teaching at a community college while I was still on active duty. And that allowed me to study domestic terrorism then, which is the term of art, at a time where I was normally only focused overseas. And it was during that time that I studied Timothy McVeigh's radicalization, working in the Rust Belt, angry, disenfranchised, following the notion of a doctrine created by Louis Beam, if I'm not mistaken, this idea of self-radicalization, act as a lone actor, don't organize. And we think this is new, that ISIS offered this and Al-Qaeda before them. It is similar in both milieus, the right, left, and jihadi. Of course, we're going to get away from left and right because I think that's problemsome. But the bottom line is, it is about disenfranchisement, along with idiosyncratic personalities, along with some problems with psychology and social also social movement theory. All of these things come into play. I talk to a jihadi, a former terrorist, quite frequently, and we interact, and I do check-ins with him because he served his time in jail, and we talk about his radicalization path. It's not dissimilar from people that are in the white power milieu, and I use that in quotes. So it is a very interesting dynamic. They can be studied in parallel. And in fact, we know that people that want to execute targeted violence or mass shootings, they shop around their ideology. They'll dabble in the right-wing milieu, there I go again, or they'll dabble in the jihadi milieu. Whatever satisfies and sates their determination to commit violence. So that's why our policing has to in accordance with First Amendment protections, has to very carefully police that internet and look for when, and I use that very broadly and cautiously, but they have to look for the idea that somebody's getting ready to mobilize for violence. That's what are those triggers. So it is troublesome. It is a problem, to be sure.
Chris, thank you so much. I think that was a really important element to add into this discussion. Doug, I have kind of a two-pronged question for you. The first prong is probably a little harder to answer, or at least a little bit more of a challenge politically. But I think one of the emerging trends, or the perceived trends in the Middle East region over the last few years, both under the Obama administration and also under Trump, is the perception that the US is quote unquote withdrawing from the region. I think we can all argue against the idea that we're actually withdrawing, but there is a perception of decreasing US interest in the same way that our allies in the region had got used to in previous years. And within that context, we've seen some examples of some of our allies trying to step up doing things themselves. I think the Yemen war was probably the most sort of stark example in that respect. And I think probably US experts within the US government are probably more or less unanimous that hasn't gone particularly well. And so likewise, from a CT perspective, I imagine that many of our allies are trying to do more themselves with less hand holding from the US. So the first prong is this general trend a good thing? I think it pleases some of the popular opinion within the US, but is it necessarily moving things in the right direction? And as the second prong of that question, how do we measure that? Metrics is a word that's repeatedly come up in this discussion. And beyond the big challenge of measuring success beyond kinetic action, how do we measure the success of our allies in terms of actions they're undertaking independently, or at the very least with less US involvement than we might have seen 10 or 15 years ago?
So fear of multi-part questions is why I pursued a liberal arts education and didn't take much math, but I'll do what I can. I think what folks don't perhaps appreciate as much is that our presence in locations, whether it's the Middle East, South Asia, wherever it might be, in terms of the counter-terrorist effort, it's less of us being there and telling people what to do and throwing our resources around. A lot of it is leveraging what foreign partners can do on the ground. We rely on platforms, be they for military or intelligence collection, at the good grace of foreign partners, whether it's the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Force in the Kurdistan region of Northwest Syria, whether it's our Iraqi partners, the counter-terrorist units in the government there, Afghanistan and such like that. We can't have a presence at all without those platforms. And without those platforms, we can't serve as, if I would really like to put it, a force multiplier, working with partners, leveraging their larger capabilities on the ground, bringing in specific support, whether it's advice, guidance, particular weapons, training, what have you, or on the civilian side as well. As we withdraw from such places, as we sort of give up our leadership role, because that's what we bring to a lot of this is leadership, the United States still carries great cachet. despite whatever is going on and regardless of the politics. But when you strike deals with these partners and you're working with folks on the ground, and then you just sort of pick up stakes and move away, they lose face, for one thing, which is significant, particularly in the Middle East. And they've often extended themselves and the role that their government, their military, their services can play to leverage mutual interests, which would be, pushing back ISIS from the caliphate, if you would, in Iraq and Syria, or mitigating the threat from Al Qaeda in South Asia and trying to stop the expansion of the Taliban. So those coalitions that we build, those partnerships, are vital to our interests. We're not doing them a favor. In reality, they're doing us a favor. What we bring to the table financially really is not what they're after. They're after our leadership. They're after what we could bring to help them be stronger. And when we sort of abandon them out there, that leaves them high and dry. And they don't forget. They have long memories. The Kurds have long memories from before the time of, back to Saddam Hussein. So every time we do this, we lose a bit. It becomes harder for folks on the ground, whether it's on the diplomatic side, ambassadors, military sides, theater commanders, station chiefs on the part of the CIA, to go to, hey, we really need to work together on this. They're remembering, remember when you left me high and dry last time. So that's a problem. On the metrics issue, metrics are tough to reflect what the real counterterrorism challenges are. We rely on metrics of strikes, beautiful videos of things getting blown up, body counts, people that are arrested, things that are sexy and attractive. But to try to measure success in the counterterrorism field, it's more problematic when you're looking at, well, is the absence of attacks success? How do we measure change in ideology? How do we measure maybe cooperation? It might be helpful to look at what metrics would come from bringing greater literacy to communities, bringing greater health opportunities to community that would offer the type of stability that might tend them to resist the Taliban, ISIS, and other groups organizationally. But to Karen's point, from a local point of view, not preach hate. You asked Chris an excellent question about radicalization, and the focus was domestic, and Chris made a good point that there's common threads on domestic and foreign. It's largely victimization, it's fear, it's a sense of justice that affects them locally. Who's coming to hurt me? Whether it's the white supremacists think the central government or people of color are going to take their jobs or influence their community, or whether it's folks in Idlib who think the United States is trying to re-indoctrinate their children and bring whatever Western excesses their way. People interpret this on a local level. We don't need to make people wave the Constitution and the American flag and love us. We need them to trust us enough to understand we're not a threat to them. We might be able to offer something to them. And then you're addressing the issues of victimization, fear, and justice that might otherwise motivate them, but importantly, their communities. Because particularly on the foreign terrorist side, these folks are spotted, cultivated, recruited in their communities, whether that's tribe or whether that's family. And that's how they respond. I think we see some of that to the extent that white supremacism is an issue here, at least the ideology coming out of groups and ultranationalism, but I'm not as equipped to make the same comparisons to what we see overseas.
Doug, thank you so much for that. Karen, we'll turn to you. I have a question bringing together a bunch of different things in terms of the importance, as you see it, of ungoverned spaces and IDPs or large IDP populations. The first part of the question is, what can the US actually do about those issues by itself or in concert with allies? And the second part of it, just throw in from myself, is one of the things, there's been a long-standing debate about the aid community from a government perspective, making it more efficient, tailoring it to work more closely in conjunction with wider aspects of foreign policy or regional policy. and whether or not that's right, whether aid policy should be solely independent from foreign policy or done in closer conjunction with it. And one thing we've seen as a dual American-British citizen, taking my American hat off for a second and looking at the UK, is that the DFID, the Department for International Development, was just recently merged into the Foreign Office in a move that many people have assumed was to do exactly that, to make aid policy more closely tailored with the wider foreign policy of the British government. Clearly, we're not seeing that in the US, although there are other questions around USAID these days. But placing that into the context of what can the US do in terms of such a significant challenge, and whether or not it may or may not make sense to tailor our response to more closely fit our broader diplomatic actions. I'd just be interested to hear your thoughts on that rather large question.
Yeah, it's a, yeah. So that's interesting about Britain. I didn't know that. That's fascinating. So here's what I think. I think, what can the United States do? Part of me wants to say, exercise some leadership in the displaced persons communities, wherever they are, whether they're contained or uncontained. But I think given the issue of US leadership and where it can go right now, that may not be the answer, but certainly the international cooperation is important. And by the way, it's not just about, at this point, about terrorism. Look at COVID. Look what COVID has done to these communities and who's responding and who's not responding. And this is complicated. I know this isn't just a diplomatic thing. It's complicated by sanctions, right? To what extent is policy that we have in another realm, to your point about Britain, is policy we have in another realm counterproductive to what we're trying to do in terms of dealing with displaced persons who otherwise might turn towards violence of whatever sort. So I think despite all of that, US leadership could be vastly important. We have problems in this regard right now. Our State Department has not been the most robust of our efforts in the world. Parts of it have been curtailed. That's going to need to be rebuilt. We have partners who in this complex world don't trust us and who we don't trust. But one thing that could be done is to prioritize it. And the United States could take that lead with other nations and prioritize the fact that this needs to be focused on in a constructive way and not in a, to Doug's point, a fearful way. So it's a broad question and a broad answer, but the answer is yes, let's pay attention to it, first of all, and US leadership should not be downplayed.
Great, thank you so much, Karen. And as always, Doug, Chris, if you ever have anything to offer to in response, do let me know. But if not, Chris, I have a question to you, making reference to a comment that CENTCOM Commander General Mackenzie recently made on another Middle East Institute event, which was he appeared to suggest that the US knows rather than believes that Al-Qaeda leader Ayman al-Zawahiri is based right now in Afghanistan. And not in Pakistan. And within the whole context of continuing or not continuing negotiations with the Taliban, a peace deal or not a peace deal, whether the Taliban has agreed to work against Al-Qaeda or not with Al-Qaeda, what if that's true, if that assessment or belief is true, that Zawahiri is in Afghanistan and not Pakistan, what, in your opinion, and I know this is kind of, asking you to speculate, but what does that or might that imply anything in terms of Al-Qaeda's sort of strategy in that region with an eye to an eventual US withdrawal? Do you personally, in your opinion, believe that the Taliban will cease working with Al-Qaeda? And if I may, does any of that have any implications on ISIS's future in Afghanistan? I know that's a lot of things to take in, but I would be interested in your opinion.
Yeah, I didn't hear General Mackenzie's comment, but so I haven't had a lot of time to reflect on it, but I'll just offer this at first blush. One, ISIS will continue to merge with disenfranchised Taliban. That is going to happen at some level. I think the Taliban are always going to be sympathetic also at some level to Al-Qaeda. They hosted them. The border is amorphous. I look at the border as as being an area that it's almost not relevant, Pakistan or Afghanistan, and particularly in the tribal areas. So at the end of the day, I wouldn't read too much into that, other than the necessity for Al-Qaeda senior leadership to have to move frequently, which is a result of the fact that the United States still has robust capabilities and are still I suspect, interested in tracking senior leadership to use direct action against them as another disruptive measure. So I think that will continue. I wouldn't look too far into it. It's almost we looked at al-Baghdadi, found himself surprisingly in an Al-Qaeda stronghold because that might be a place we wouldn't look. It seems surprising. So there's a logic there, right? So that's how I would view it. But I do worry about the idea that networks will join together, the enemy of one's enemy. So I worry about that long term in Afghanistan. But of course, that was the central argument I would have made in August of 2017 on the reason why we needed to stay in Afghanistan, at least to see if our strategy was going to work. And I think to date, it hasn't worked tremendously. So it's time for us to look for some kind of peace and reconciliation. But the central problem is, what do you do when there's ungoverned space in Afghanistan and whatever Afghan government in place doesn't take the appropriate action? We still have to remember that 9/11 had, happened as a result of the Taliban hosting them. So that never moves too far away from our collective memory. At the same time, it's time for some peace and reconciliation out of Afghanistan. So we're going to have to work really hard at making sure the right metrics are in place, that we have some capability, some platform to go after Al-Qaeda if they're operating on the ground in Afghanistan. I mean, the last time I checked and spoke about this, there were just a couple hundred Al-Qaeda hardcore on the ground in Afghanistan. And ISIS was similarly significantly attrited. But that's going to ebb and flow with the idea of disenfranchised former Taliban that want something different than what the future of Afghanistan may offer.
Right, thank you, Chris. I think that's quite sobering. Doug, ask you a tricky question perhaps, and following on really from this discussion just about the Taliban, but bringing us over to northwestern Syria, an area that you referenced a few times in your report. There we've seen an organization that used to be officially and in the open an affiliate of Al-Qaeda, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, as it's now known, or HTS, increasingly distance itself from AQ, localize increasingly in terms of its everyday agenda. And as we've seen just in the last few weeks, openly fight Al-Qaeda's affiliates, retake their territory, force them from key strategic towns. And this is a group, I guess I'm biased because I've worked on HTS and Nusra before it for nearly a decade, but this is a group that has an open political office. It seeks to establish political relationships. Its ideology remains almost just as extreme as it was before, but it's clearly trying to pivot into something that's different. It looks to me like a Shami or Levantine version of the Taliban with its different cultural orientations. How would the US, from an intel perspective or from a political or military one, how does the US view an organization like that? That it in and of itself doesn't necessarily directly pose a threat of international or external attacks, but its presence may or may not provide a safe haven or a potential safe haven for others who do. What kind of means does the US have to, if it wanted to, counter an organization like that? I mean, in my opinion, it poses an entirely different challenge than a globally oriented jihadist group. So I would just be interested in terms of, having lived in the IC for so long, does an organization like that raise as many alarm bells as AQ itself? Are they a lesser priority, or are they a different priority? I would just be interested in your position on that.
I'm going to try to tie together your questions about HTS and the situation in Levant with the question you posed, Chris, with a discussion of the lack of openness of the current White House to intelligence. So in Afghanistan, there is any body of evidence to reflect continuing and close cooperation between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. I think Chris referenced to maybe 200 hardcore fighters. We've had that same number more or less for years and years. The problem is Al-Qaeda is not monolithic. There's core Al-Qaeda, there's its affiliate Al-Qaeda in South Asia, which is more active there. It has more fighters and such like that. But the Pentagon itself put out a report on July 1st, just a few days ago, which reflected continuing and close cooperation between Al-Qaeda, particularly the affiliate Al-Qaeda in South Asia, with the Taliban, continuing support and contribution to attacks, continuing support from the Taliban to provide its sanctuary. The United Nations put out a more detailed report on that level of cooperation just, I think, in May, which went on in great detail about the integration between certain Al-Qaeda units and commandos, which has always been the case, and Taliban units to whom they provide training, assistance, guidance, fabrication, engineering assistance, and the like. So none of this reporting is withheld. For instance, Mark Frericks, a US contractor, was kidnapped in Khost province weeks before we signed the agreement with the Taliban, and it never came up as a condition for signing the agreement. Mr. Frericks remains in what I would presume to be Haqqani Taliban network custody. Hostages is an issue that Chris is very dedicated to. We've spoken and worked with often on that. I have great pride and respect for working with him on that. But yet the president dismissed it and pushed on. The same issue then takes us back to the Levant, if I can now walk over. We've given the White House intelligence on what the implications are of the dynamics on the ground, of the threats, the threat to us of withdrawing as we did, in undermining our cooperation with the SDF, in losing, compromising equities with that group, the coalition, and the CT elements in Iraq, which has been dismissed. To your point, my personal opinion, I see HTS, I think, as you're suggesting, more as a local insurgency. Even in its days as the Nusra Front, it seemed less focused on terrorism than Haras al-Din, which its forerunner was the Corazon Group, which was made up of more legacy type Al-Qaeda folks that date back to al-Musab, Zakawi, and even the days of Afghanistan. So as an intel community, we have to look at it from 2 points of view. We have to look at what are the implications for Syria from a group like HTS and its impact on the ground, politically, socially, and such, and then where it fits with Haras al-Din, and Haras al-Din will be replaced by something, no doubt, as it maybe got a little bit too ambitious doing things locally, which is what got HTS mad at it, where it's kind of try to bring it back. So you need to distinguish between counterinsurgency and counterterrorism. We've done that poorly in Afghanistan. I fear we are liable to repeat the same mistakes in Syria.
Right, thank you so much, Doug. That was a sobering response too. So we're coming up to nearly time up. So I just thought, why don't I give the three of you, 90 seconds each or so for any closing comments. There are, believe it or not, things we still haven't touched upon. We haven't talked much about the online space. Yeah, why don't we start with Karen first? We'll then go to Chris and then to Doug to close things out.
Yeah, so I think I want to end where we began, which is that this is an important report, and I think it needs like version 2, which is, okay, this is interesting that you've laid out, but if we're really going to reassess where we are, which is what you're asking for a rethinking, maybe we need to open up some new lanes. And so, you made the distinction at the end between counterinsurgency and counterterrorism, right? Which there are so many things, whether it's nation building versus counterterrorism, whether it's counterinsurgency strategy versus counterterrorism strategy. We need to sort of, I don't want to leave them behind, but we need to incorporate into, in your words, a more holistic vision. And also a little more respect for our communities of expertise, the intelligence community, the State Department, and we could mention others. I think that we have to rely on what we have. and ask for similar reflections across the board, and look forward to a future where those voices are heard. And I think you're right. That is a problem. If we have all this expertise and it doesn't have any place to put its expert insights. And I think, like you're doing now, this is a very good time for reflection on lessons learned, both positive and negative.
Karen, thank you. Chris?
So right up front, again, I want to thank you for the opportunity to joining today. This was an excellent discussion. I appreciate really the framing of the problem that Doug has offered in his paper, and I encourage folks to read it. All that said, I want to end on a positive, which is hard to do in the counterterrorism arena, right? We didn't sleep well. We don't sleep well in this business, or I certainly didn't when I was involved with this business, because you can never gloat about a success. You can never gloat about a strike, or the fact that you have an excellent source somewhere in the world that's reporting on counterterrorism issues, because you don't know when you're going to fall victim. There's never 100% fall victim to some kind of attack. And yes, we have kept the nation safe from something of the scale of a 9/11. All of that said, what was so interesting about Doug's paper is it started with the very premise that I had coming into the White House. And then I realized in very quick order that this was cumulative work. There was a staying arc of continuity between professionals that were galvanized by the need to keep the nation safe. So I am confident that going forward, our strategy will get increasingly better, regardless of the administration that's responsible for counterterrorism. But it's never going to satisfy everyone listening in on this discussion, because we're not going to get to root causes across the globe. We're not going to solve all the detainee problems. We tried to work with other countries. So what we're going to continue to do is have discrete counterterrorism campaigns that's part of a broader strategy look at a region, for example. And it took a whole year for me to fully process that our approach to counterterrorism on the ground in Syria was really very much related and came in sharp focus when you understood what we wanted to do with regard to Iran, which was counter their malign behavior. Through that lens, you can appreciate that we have tempered some of the Iranian behavior. Long-term, history will judge if this has been good or bad. Everything from the strike against Soleimani to really strangling Iran economically with the maximum pressure campaign. All of these things remain to be seen and will be assessed by analysts and historians in the future. That said, I am confident that going forward, we will have the appropriate framework to get at the problems that are more adaptive. So I expect whatever administration's in place in January, they will focus more on the idea of far-right terrorists, extremists, and that's a very much an adaptive approach to our strategy and reprioritization and reapportioning of resources. So all that said, I am confident that the counterterrorism professionals, notwithstanding other charges of politicization of intelligence, it's the professionals in the CT arena that will look at the intelligence and will unflinchingly make policy recommendations to their respective bosses in the administration.
Chris, thank you so much. And then finally, Doug, after you.
Well, you end with me at your peril, because I think fundamentally the problem that we have that we've not been able to get away from since 9/11 is we think we're winning. And we have a great many tactical successes to demonstrate how we're winning. We have a great many videos of terrorist leaders being killed, and we beat our chest, and I've seen it. I've seen the consequences in the after action of various counter-terrorist operations where everyone's focused on, okay, this guy is off the battlefield, we can move on. I've never seen that more reflected than in the current administration, which is, let's seriously move on and start walking away, because we're done here. So long as there's a mentality that what we're doing on a tactical level is victory, is winning, we're not going to be open to looking at what we're missing, to looking at alternative models. There is no substantive appetite I have seen to, well, let's do something different. Why do something different if you think you're winning? So until such time as I think we have a healthier conversation that's willing to look at more perspectives and where we're not winning and longer range, we're not going to be able to change what we've been doing, and we're not going to be able to take it to the level that's necessary to truly have a long and lasting effect on counterterrorism within the greater rubric of all the other issues that are affecting national security, as I think Karen articulated quite so well.
Doug, thank you so much. Good to have some different closing remarks. Yeah, Karen, Chris, and Doug, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your really insightful comments and remarks. And ladies and gentlemen around the world, thank you ever so much for joining this panel. We'll be sure to be back with many more to come. So without further ado, thank you everybody, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.